Welcome to the Celestial Saga channel. Have you ever wondered how a single order from the Emperor can turn the best warrior into a participant in a crowd-pleasing performance? Today we will tell you how the execution of the order changed the fate of not only Commander Jackson, but the entire Empire. Commander Jackson's mind wasn't occupied with thoughts of ultimate predators as he maneuvered around the final metallic opponent in his training. The polished floor of the chamber was littered with two lifeless, sparking bodies, their circuits fried by his perfectly executed tail strikes. Now, only one adversary remained, its red optics glowing with simulated fury. Jackson's dark, mottled green skin, flecked with patches of deep brown, caught the harsh light of the chamber, glinting with an almost dangerous gleam. His powerful, muscular form rippled with controlled tension, each movement deliberate and calculated. His heart pounded fiercely within his broad chest, the rhythm echoing in sync with the swaying of his long, serrated tail which tapered to a deadly razor-sharp point. With a low, throaty growl vibrating from deep within, he lunged forward, his tail cutting through the air with the precision of a blade, targeting the dummy's vulnerable neck. But just before the strike landed, a voice, smooth and sharp, like a knife slicing through silence, interrupted the moment. "Commander Jackson, you are ordered to present yourself before Emperor Valen orders?" Jackson faltered, his concentration splintering. The dummy seized the opportunity, shifting its stance and delivering a swift surprise kick directly to his chest. The blow came without warning, blurring toward him in a flash. Jackson's world tilted violently, and before he could react, darkness consumed him as he staggered backward, crashing into the cold wall. Pain shot through him, but his mind raced, anticipating the follow-up strike. However, his expectation was betrayed. The dummy's eyes dimmed, its body going limp as its power supply was cut, collapsing to its knees. The door to the chamber slid open just then, revealing the source of that commanding voice. She was a woman, her skin shimmering with flawless yellow scales that gleamed like polished gold in the chamber's harsh light. Her form was slender yet strong, each movement flowing with a grace that bordered on hypnotic. Her long limbs were perfectly proportioned, radiating an air of royalty enhanced by the intricate, glowing patterns etched into her scales, which seemed to pulse with an inner energy. Her emerald eyes were calm, exuding a quiet authority, and the way she carried herself suggested a woman who owned not just the room, but the very air around her, a presence Jackson had only witnessed on Imperial broadcasts or in the depths of his own imagination. "You're not from around here, are you?" Jackson stammered, his mind still recovering from the shock of the sudden attack. For a moment, he had forgotten the disruption to his training, even the order he had just been given. She rolled her eyes in exasperation, the movement a clear sign of impatience. "You've been chosen as the executioner of the skipper Emperor Valen has summoned you to Halan. The order is immediate, follow me." Her voice, once smooth, now carried an edge of command, demanding attention. Executioner? Halan? Skipper? Jackson's mind struggled to catch up with the unexpected directive. His thoughts were spinning. "Hold on," he protested, his voice thick with disbelief. "You can't just show up here and expect me to drop everything and head for Halan. Besides, those skippers are legendary creatures for a reason they're impossible to track, let alone kill." Her tail twitched in irritation. "You're not paid to think Emperor Valen's orders override any other task you have. Either you come with me to the cradle, or you face the consequences for disobedience. Here, on this forsaken rock. Your choice." For a brief moment, Jackson found himself mesmerized by her striking appearance, but the cold, commanding tone of her voice shattered the illusion. How could someone so beautiful carry such an iron will? Disobeying an emperor could ruin his career, so he had little choice but to concede. "If you're so set on having me along, then it's done," he said reluctantly, his voice betraying his unwillingness. Without another word, she turned and flicked her tail, a silent command for him to follow. He did so, falling into step beside her as they navigated the vast bay areas. Along the way, the eyes of his fellow soldiers followed them, their gazes filled with envy as they noticed her beauty. Jackson cursed under his breath. They were all too focused on her calm demeanor to see the coldness beneath it. The glances only seemed to spur her on, and her pace quickened, leaving Jackson, already exhausted from training, struggling to keep up. "Why the hurry?" he huffed, his voice barely audible over the constant sound of their footsteps. "Emperor Valen doesn't like to wait," she replied curtly. Her words didn't truly make sense until they reached the gate station. This wasn't the typical bustling public gate where various species appeared and disappeared in a constant flow. No, this was the stark private terminal. The lines were empty, and heavily armed guards stood at attention, exuding authority. This part of the base was unfamiliar to Jackson, and as the gate numbers dwindled from hundreds to dozens, then down to mere digits, his unease grew. "Where exactly are you taking me?" he asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "Gate number 1, she said simply. Being summoned to Halan by the Emperor was terrifying enough. But gate number 1? The most renowned gate on any planet, a relic more symbolic of tradition and power than practical use. Every species knew that this gate was not just any portal, it could take you to the Imperial Palace itself. As they approached the gate, Jackson noticed something different. While other gates were guarded by soldiers with modern weapons, this one was protected by only 2 guards, each holding a spear angled just so, their crossed weapons blocking the way. As Jackson considered what kind of authorization they would need to pass through, the woman raised her arms, revealing an emblem etched into her scales. The imperial symbol was not simply marked, but was burned into her skin. The guards responded immediately, clearing the path with barely a word, all while giving her a single dismissive glance. With a swallow of apprehension, Jackson followed her as they approached the swirling vortex of purple and blue, the dimensional portal that would transport them to the Imperial Palace in Halan. "This gate is the oldest of them all," she warned, her voice steady as they stood at the threshold of the vortex. "It will be unlike anything you're used to." Jackson's question was interrupted as they took the final step. A blinding flash engulfed him, erasing the view of the base behind them. He felt himself suspended in a void, weightless, drifting. The air felt thick, almost like gelatin, as if the very fabric of reality was being stretched and twisted. This sensation was unlike any gate travel he'd experienced before. Instead of the usual smooth transition, it felt as though his limbs were being stretched and contorted into unfamiliar and uncomfortable shapes. Looking down at his hand, it seemed enormous, but when he curled his fingers into a fist, it shrank to a tiny, almost infantile size. Just then, he heard a chuckle, and when he glanced to the side, her cold demeanor melted into a smirk. "What is your name?" His voice, deeper than expected, seemed to amuse her. Her answer came with her disproportionately large head and an even larger smile, her voice oddly deep, almost comical. "Lyra," she said. Jackson was captivated by the surreal spectacle, but suddenly the tunnel widened and the pulling sensation ceased. He stumbled as solid ground appeared beneath his feet, his body snapping back into reality with a forceful jolt. He gasped, inhaling deeply as his vision cleared. The blinding light faded away, replaced by the dim, cold stone walls of a vast chamber. Turning, he found Lyra standing beside him, her expression as cold as ever, a sharp contrast to the moment of playfulness they'd just shared. For a moment, he wondered if it had all been a hallucination. Was Lyra really her name, or had he imagined the entire exchange? "Lyra," he managed to say, his voice hoarse. She glanced at him as if he were a fool, her voice flat and cold. "What?" Jackson opened his mouth to mention the trip, but before he could speak, a cacophony of childish laughter and chatter erupted. He turned to see a group of energetic children racing past heavily armed guards, heading straight toward them. "Lyra, Lyra, look what I did!" A young girl held her tail, which was covered in red paint, as if she had used it as a brush. "Look here." A smaller boy proudly showed off his red-painted belly, his smile radiating joy. "Quite the artist, aren't you, Layla?" Lyra said, her expression softening just a little. "But remember, your tail is for balance in battle, not for painting." She turned her attention to the boy. "And you, Jalen, wear your artwork with pride, but don't turn yourself into a canvas too often. We'll need you to be a warrior someday." She wasted no time dismissing the children, telling them she would play with them later. Jackson noticed the warmth beneath her words, but it didn't erase the coldness of her demeanor, at least, not like it had been in the strange space between the gates. He was puzzled by her behavior, but didn't have time to ask questions. As she moved toward the guards, Lyra held out her wrist, showing the imperial symbol to the guards ahead. As before, they immediately cleared the way to the Imperial Palace without hesitation. Ahead of them stretched a labyrinth of corridors. An overwhelming array of paths. Lyra took the lead, guiding him through the halls and stairways, which, apart from the lights, seemed devoid of modern comforts. Jackson had a lot of questions. but instinctively he waited until they were alone. However, as soon as he spoke, he regretted his words. "Are those your children?" "No," she replied curtly, and Jackson felt an awkward silence settle between them. After a moment, she added, "Emperor Valen prefers the giddy ones to be the mothers." That one sentence sent his mind spinning, only to be abruptly snapped back to reality when the cold steel of a knife pressed against his throat. Lyra could only be one of Emperor Valen's concubines. Her cold demeanor, a carefully crafted mask, and her brief admission of unhappiness confirmed it. Despite this, he knew that keeping his distance from her was the wisest choice. She belonged to Valen, after all. For the rest of their walk, the only sound was the steady rhythm of their footsteps. As long as he kept his gaze away from her, Jackson had little trouble pushing her from his mind. After all, he barely knew her, and from what he had learned, he decided it was best to know no more. They finally reached a vast, opulent chamber. The polished floor reflected the dim light filtering through ornate stained glass windows. At the center of the room, Emperor Valen sat upon a grand obsidian throne adorned with sharp black crystals, his eyes lazily scanning the room. He wasn't as old as Jackson had expected, but his belly was even larger than the imperial broadcasts had suggested. This was clear, even with fine fabrics covering his scales. Jackson quickly looked away, avoiding staring at the emperor, instead focusing on the double row of guards flanking the throne. Their spears stood tall, while a group of concubines lounged around the emperor, draped in luxurious fabrics. Their soft laughter and whispers created a sharp contrast to the heavy atmosphere of the room. Lyra knelt before the emperor, her voice cold yet respectful in the practiced way of a concubine. "Your Majesty, this maid brings you Commander Jackson, as you requested." Jackson wasn't sure of the proper protocol, so he gave a slight bow and then stood straight, adopting the posture of a soldier awaiting orders. Emperor Valen turned toward him, but his gaze immediately shifted to Lyra, who still kept her head bowed. "You're late, Lyra," the emperor said, his voice serious but laced with lazy disinterest. "Why do you think I give you permission to use the old gates?" Lyra shot him a glance, and Jackson had the feeling she might blame him for the delay. "It was my short legs, Your Majesty," Lyra replied, not assigning blame to either Jackson or the children for making the Emperor Valen wait. "Commander Jackson had to wait for me as we walked." "Of course he would need to wait for you. How could a mere maid keep up with one of our finest warriors?" Valen lazily waved his hand, dismissing her. "Go, take your place." Lyra rose, blending effortlessly with the other concubines near the throne. From her new position, she offered him a fleeting, barely perceptible smile. Jackson's thoughts lingered on her for a moment too long. His reverie was abruptly shattered by the Emperor Valen's voice, sharp and unexpected. "Commander Jackson," Valen said, his tone taking on a rare edge. "Did the maid make you aware of the significance of the task I've assigned you?" "She did," Jackson answered. "I believe it was something about hunting a skipper, Your Majesty." Jackson shifted his gaze down to the floor, embarrassed by his earlier fixation on Lyra. "The skipper is already captured and chained to the arena floor," Valen's voice thundered over the quiet murmur of the concubines. "Your task is not to hunt it, but to execute it in front of the crowd." "Execute it for an audience?" Jackson blurted out too quickly. "Why would you have me commit such a dishonorable act, Your Majesty?" He raised his eyes to gauge the Emperor Valen's response and felt a wave of relief wash over him when he saw that the same lazy indifference lingered in Valen's gaze. "Foolish pride of a young warrior," Valen muttered, adjusting his posture, with the help of the concubines, standing straighter, his presence now more imposing. "You must not realize, Commander, that even chained, the skipper remains a dangerous adversary. Any mistake you make in handling it, and it could still kill you." "I know little about the skipper, Your Majesty, but I do know the reputation of those who partake in royal executions in the outer reaches," Jackson said, anxiety creeping into his voice. "Forgive my boldness, but if my men see me on the imperial broadcast, my reputation will be destroyed, and I will lose their respect. The respect of some bumpkin is worth less than a ship, especially after our brilliant minds created the gates," Emperor Valen said, his gaze piercing. "But I understand your predicament. Commander, fulfill my order, and you'll be promoted and stationed in a more civilized place." Jackson's eyes twitched, his anxiety growing, and his expression hardened. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty, but I cannot abandon my post in the outer reaches. The law enforcement work on primitive species is crucial, and I've invested my entire life into it." Any warrior from Halan could carry out your execution. My involvement is truly unnecessary. You may not understand the importance of this execution to the Empire, but I will enlighten you, Valen said, his voice anchoring the room. The concubines stepped back, and the guards exchanged nervous glances. The humans are dissatisfied with the gate fees and are considering the skippers as an alternative to travel through space. They spread rumors, claiming these creatures are the key to their autonomy. This execution will prove the skippers' true danger and stop their misguided plans, and the trust other species have in them. Jackson took a step back, his unease growing. You fail to understand your delicate position, Commander, Emperor Valen said, rising from his throne with surprising strength in his legs. Refuse my command, and you'll remain nothing more than a commander. But if you succeed, you can have anything you want. Valen's weight pressed him back into his throne. I noticed where your eyes wandered earlier. Fulfill my command, and you could even have one of those maids, perhaps one of the beautiful ones, not the second-rate ones you see here. Jackson was taken aback by the laughter that spread among the concubines, as though the Emperor Valen had told a joke rather than insulted them and offered them as a reward. Isora stood among them, her face betraying no amusement. Jackson hesitated, torn between his options, but a flicker of baser emotions surfaced. He finally gave in. I will be your executioner, your majesty naturally. A faint smile appeared on Valen's lips, then quickly faded, replaced by the same disinterest as before. You will train for 10 days before the execution. I expect nothing less than a perfect display of power. When you perform before the other species, failure will not be tolerated. Jackson was about to ask why training was necessary, when a subtle flick of the Emperor Valen's hand sent one of the guards briskly stepping out of formation. Before Jackson could fully comprehend the situation, he found himself being ushered out of the royal chamber. As the heavy doors began to close behind him, he cast a final glance over his shoulder. The concubines had already swarmed around the Emperor Valen, their laughter and flirtations filling the air. Yet, amid the attempts to amuse him, one pair of eyes lingered on Jackson, watching his departure with an intensity he didn't dare try to understand. Hours later, Jackson found himself in Halan's arena. The place emanated an ancient grandeur, with towering stone pillars at each corner, standing like silent sentinels from a forgotten era. At the heart of the arena was the skipper, the ultimate predator he had been ordered to kill. The first sign of its presence was the ominous clank of heavy chains straining under its immense strength. As the dust settled from its last outburst, its massive form came into view, dark, shimmering fur twisting light around it. Jackson's breath caught in his throat as his eyes met the creature's purple, glowing gaze, an eerie connection that sent a shiver down his spine, filling him with primal terror. Its eyes, like portals, seemed to resonate in the air, warping the space around them as though the very laws of reality bent to its will. For a moment, Jackson swore its form flickered, as if it weren't fully bound to this world. The arena trembled beneath the weight of this ancient, terrifying beast. As Jackson stared, mesmerized by the creature he was meant to execute, a voice cut through the tension like a blade. Ready for your first practical training? The sudden question yanked him out of his fearful trance. Are you the one bringing the prop weapon? Jackson asked, still disoriented, his heart still pounding from the connection he had felt with the beast. My name's Kalen, the soldier responded, still focused on the skipper. Your weapon's over there. Jackson followed his gesture and saw a bulky metallic backpack resting on the ground. A thick, reinforced cable connected it to a handheld laser gun, its barrel gleaming ominously, though Jackson knew it wasn't the real weapon. That looks heavy, but at least it's ranged and the target can't move. Jackson hadn't fully accepted his role as executioner, but his outward composure showed no sign of the inner conflict churning within him. It's not ranged, Kalen said, delivering the unwelcome truth. By Emperor Valen's order, it's designed to be used by pressing the muzzle against the target. Something about showing the might of our warriors. Jackson stared at the weapon, then at the skipper, his mind taking a moment to process that he would need to approach that beast. This is what I get for the countless days spent in the training chamber, he muttered under his breath. Kalen tapped his shoulder with his tail. You'll do well. You're the fastest evader in the Empire. Just get close and avoid the mouth. Get close and avoid the mouth? Jackson almost laughed at the absurdity. The beast could warp reality itself, its name coming from its ability to skip between dimensions. And yet, he'd been worried about honor. The thought was laughable. If he could, he'd go back in time and slap some sense into himself with his tail. Kalen offered no reply, but Jackson could feel the weight of the other guard's expectant stares as he reached for the prop weapon. The heavy backpack settled onto his shoulders, grounding him in the moment. The tension in the air was palpable as eyes followed him, watching him take his first step into the arena. The skipper reacted immediately, its massive legs pushing against the ground, straining the colossal chains that bound it not only to the arena, but to reality itself. The creature, once the embodiment of freedom, was now a prisoner, its fury evident in every powerful movement. "Careful now." Kalen's voice cut through the tension. "It can't skip realities, but sometimes it brings things from other dimensions." Jackson's gaze locked with the skipper's, and he pushed the caution aside. He sprinted, deliberately avoiding a direct path toward the beast he needed to adjust the weapon's weight before committing to any serious movement. The skipper's eyes tracked every step he took, its glowing purple orb seeming to analyze him, as if it knew he wasn't yet making his real attempt. There was an unnerving intelligence in its gaze, reminding Jackson that this wasn't some ordinary animal. Jackson quickly realized that brute force wouldn't work against a creature like this. Adapting his approach, he moved with calculated caution, circling the beast multiple times to acclimate to the weight of the weapon. Every time he considered coming up behind it, the unsettling swish of the skipper's tail made him hesitate. Finally, with muscles coiled in a deep breath, Jackson charged toward the creature's head, his eyes fixed on the length of the chain, acutely aware of how much he preferred not being eaten. The skipper noticed the change in Jackson's approach immediately, its eyes glowing ominously, and Jackson braced himself for whatever might come next. But nothing could have prepared him for the distortion in the space above his head, followed by a massive rock materializing from thin air. Reflex took over, and Jackson ducked to the side with the help of his tail, narrowly avoiding the incoming boulder. It slammed into the ground with a force that created a shockwave, leaving Jackson wide-eyed at the resulting crater. If he hadn't moved, it would have crushed him. The guards' open mouths confirmed the gravity of the situation, and Jackson briefly thought about retreating, but he was already too close to back down, drawing on every ounce of strength. He pushed off the ground with his tail and sprinted forward. Just as another space distortion appeared, Jackson dodged, narrowly avoiding a massive tree trunk that slammed into the earth beside him. Now within striking range, his finger tightened on the trigger, aligning the muzzle of his weapon with the skipper's head. Victory seemed within reach, but Jackson stayed cautious, keeping an eye on the creature's mouth and the length of its chains. Yet, he had overlooked something crucial. In the blink of an eye, the skipper's massive paw shot out, its claws slicing through the air. Before Jackson could react, the muzzle of his weapon was knocked aside, and he was yanked off balance, crashing to the ground. The impact was harsh, sending dirt into his mouth as he tumbled. The shouts of alarm from the guards echoed in his ears as he scrambled on all fours, his tail propelling him just in time to avoid another rock that crashed down where he had been breathless and humbled. Jackson retreated to safety, the guards watching with a mix of respect and concern. Kalen's voice broke the tense silence before Jackson could catch his breath. "I suppose I should have mentioned the claws." "You think?" Jackson spat the dirt from his mouth, shaking his head as he threw the heavy backpack to the ground. All he wanted was to get away from the arena and breathe some fresh air. But before he could take another step, Kalen's voice stopped him. "Better get back soon or Emperor Valen won't be happy." Jackson had no plans to run, but he saw no reason to respond. He stormed down the dimly lit corridor that led outside, his mind still tangled in the aftermath of the fight. As he moved, he almost walked past a hooded figure leaning against the wall. It wasn't until a sharp psst cut through the air that he stopped and turned. The figure slowly pulled back their hood, revealing a familiar face. "Mira, what are you doing here?" Jackson asked, momentarily stunned. Her yellow scales shimmered under the low light, and her voice was softer than before. "I need to ask you something." She stepped closer, her gaze piercing through him. "When this execution is over, will you take me with you?" Jackson blinked, caught completely off guard. "Huh? What? Will you request me as your reward?" Her words hit him harder than he expected, and his heart skipped a beat as he searched for something to say. "I don't know," he admitted, voice uncertain. Mira's face dropped, and her tone turned cold. "Is that it?" Is it because you want one of the beautiful ones? Am I not good enough for you? Suddenly, the danger of the battle with the skipper seemed distant and trivial. I thought maybe asking for a mountain of platinum or gold would be less risky than asking for one of Emperor Valen's women. Her eyes softened, and she took a step closer, her tail curling gently around his, pressing from behind. Valen has his flaws, but he always keeps his promises. Her touch sent a surge of thoughts through Jackson's mind. But one question stuck out. Is that what you call him when you're alone with him? For a split second, Jackson thought she might deny any connection to Emperor Valen, but instead, she surprised him. Yes, but do you want to know what I always call him in my head? Jackson hesitated, and before he could respond, she leaned in, her hands resting lightly on his shoulders as she whispered, "His royal Fatsy." Jackson smirked, then burst out laughing. Mira stepped back, her lips curling into a sly smile before he could say anything more. She pulled her hood back on, but stayed close. "I know a place away from prying eyes," she said, turning and heading down a narrow corridor. "Come with me, and we can continue our conversation." Jackson watched her slip into the shadows, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. This could go wrong in so many ways, and for a moment, that's all he focused on. But then a glance back at the arena reminded him that his training had its own dangers, which quickly settled his nerves moments later. He found himself following Mira, eager to see where this conversation would lead. 10 days passed, and Halan's arena had transformed into a spectacle far beyond what Jackson had experienced in training. The towering stone pillars still anchored each corner, but now they were adorned with vibrant banners, each displaying the Empire's emblem, fluttering softly in the breeze. The ancient stone walls echoed with the deafening roars of the crowd, a mass of spectators who filled every inch of space. Their eager faces turned toward the center, where the execution would soon take place. Above all of them, seated on a grand elevated platform, was Emperor Valen, his gaze cold and calculating as he surveyed the scene. Flanked by his concubines and guarded by his elite soldiers among the concubines, Mira blended into the lively group around her, but Jackson knew she was watching. His eyes were drawn to the 4 massive gate frames standing ominously at the arena's edge, waiting for the Emperor Valen's signal to activate. These gates would bring visitors, travelers, and residents from across the galaxy to witness the execution of the skipper. As Jackson stepped into the arena, the weight of thousands of eyes pressed down on him. The noise of the crowd reminded him that training was over. Now, the weapon he carried wasn't just a burden, but a tool for a deadly purpose. The skipper, chained and restless, awaited him at the center, its eerie, intelligent eyes locked onto him. There would be no turning back now. Visitors, travelers, and residents of Holon. Emperor Valen's voice echoed through the arena, though he looked even thinner than Jackson had remembered. Today, those who dare spread lies about our empire will witness firsthand the true power of the skipper and understand why these beasts can never replace our gates. What do those humans think they can accomplish with skippers? Ride them across dimensions? The crowd burst into laughter at the Emperor Valen's mockery, their voices ringing out through the arena. Jackson noticed Emperor Valen subtly lowering himself back into his seat, seizing the moment. Mira had mentioned the strap he wore beneath his robes, compressing his midsection for such occasions, and Jackson found himself believing her. As the laughter faded and the Emperor Valen settled into a more comfortable position, his voice boomed again, commanding, "Open the gates!" At his word, the massive gate frames came to life with a flurry of motion. In a flash of blue and purple light, vortexes opened within the gates. From them emerged beings from different species, an avian, 2 tailless reptilians, and finally a bear-skinned creature with hair on its head. Welcome to Holon, interstellar travelers. The greetings didn't come from the Emperor Valen, but from a figure standing before the gates, positioned on the same level as the newcomers. While Emperor Valen observed from his elevated throne, "You stand in the heart of the Empire, in the core city of our vast gate network." Jackson quickly noticed that neither the Emperor Valen nor the massive crowd seemed to care about the visitor. All eyes were fixed on the skipper, its menacing presence drawing everyone's attention as though it were a magnet. Emperor Valen didn't let their astonishment linger, swiftly speaking up. "Behold, the ultimate predator," he declared, rising from his throne with palpable excitement. "This creature is the cause of gate malfunctions across the galaxy, feared and revered by many primitive species. Today, I will show you just how foolish it is to think that this beast could ever replace our gates. You will see firsthand the danger it presents and understand the kind of warrior required to slay it, even while it's chained to the ground. As the visitor's eyes shifted toward Jackson, preparing for his role in the execution, the human ambassador stepped forward, drawing attention away from him and toward the Emperor Valen. "What is the meaning of this, Emperor Valen?" The human's voice rang out, sharp and cutting through the thick tension. Without waiting for a reply, he continued, "You requested an ambassador for a celebration. And what do I find when I arrive here? A barbaric execution. Do you have any idea how much this could harm diplomatic relations between our species?" Emperor Valen chuckled, a sound that rippled through the crowd as they echoed his amusement. "This is a celebration. Human isn't the death of the universe's fiercest predator a cause for rejoicing? Calling that thing a predator is an insult to true predators," the human ambassador responded, his voice dripping with authority. "A predator hunts. That thing just skips across planets until it finds something dead to eat. It's so easily frightened that its first instinct is always to flee dimensions at the slightest noise. It only attacks when cornered, as you've made sure this one is. The skipper is nothing more than the galaxy's biggest, flashiest coward." A stunned silence fell over the arena. Jackson, like the rest of the crowd, froze in disbelief. Emperor Valen nearly toppled over as he stood, supported by his concubines. "Bold claims," Valen spat, "but can you prove it?" Without hesitation, the human ambassador began to march toward the skipper. His steps slow but confident, Jackson watched in disbelief as the human approached the beast without a shred of fear, moving directly and with boldness. "You can let them smell you first," the ambassador said, extending his hand toward the skipper's massive muzzle. Locking eyes with the creature, "Then you show vulnerability by stepping into its reach." He took another step forward, gently placing his hand on the beast's moist nose. "See? Friendly," he murmured, as though petting it. Jackson could hardly believe his eyes. In all his years of training, he had never considered such a reckless approach. The very idea felt like staring into an abyss and choosing to leap just to see what might happen. Emperor Valen stood motionless, his gaze intense and unforgiving, as though ready to order Jackson to execute both the human ambassador and the skipper right then and there. Moments later, Emperor Valen's voice thundered through the arena. "Close the gates! None of the ambassadors are to leave!" A flurry of movement erupted around the massive gate frames, swiftly closing them to prevent any escape. Even Jackson, despite his limited knowledge of politics, understood that this turn of events was bad news. The non-human ambassadors immediately raised their objections, their protests creating a chaotic chorus. Meanwhile, the human ambassador remained beside the skipper, watching the commotion unfold with calm detachment. "Arrest the human," Emperor Valen commanded. "He must be using some trick to charm the skipper. He needs to be interrogated." The guards leaped into action, surrounding the human and the skipper from all sides. The soldiers' eyes were wide with fear, hesitant to approach the creature, their weapons nervously aimed at the pair. For the first time, Jackson saw a hint of distress in the human's demeanor. The ambassador looked at the skipper and spoke to it, as though it could understand. "Time to get out of here, buddy. These people are all crazy." Taking advantage of the soldier's fear, the human dashed toward the chains that bound the skipper. After a brief struggle with the mechanism, he freed the first leg, followed quickly by the second. The final two chains were torn from the ground by the skipper's raw strength. Moments later, the creature lowered its head, allowing the human to climb its sleek black fur. "Stop them, Jackson! Kill them!" Emperor Valen's shout echoed, but it was too late. In an instant, reality flickered, and the pair vanished into thin air. The joke Emperor Valen had made at the start of the execution now hung awkwardly in the air. As the human had indeed ridden the skipper across dimensions, Jackson could do nothing but watch as chaos erupted around him. Emperor Valen immediately ordered a halt to the Imperial broadcast, followed by a command to close all gates leading to and from Halan. With his promised prize vanished and any hope of escaping unscathed rapidly fading, Jackson caught Mira's eye among the concubines. In that fleeting glance, they silently agreed on their course of action. Seizing the opportunity amid the turmoil, the two of them slipped into the crowd, vanishing from sight. Later that night, security footage showed two hooded figures breaking into Halan's zoo. One carried what was later confirmed by unofficial sources to be a bag of valuables taken from the Imperial Palace. while the other took a set of missing weapons from Halan's arsenal. The footage clearly showed them entering the zoo, but strangely, there was no record of them leaving the next morning. The only official report was that the local skipper had escaped, with the cause attributed to a failure in its containment unit.